So, welcome back as we review episode 2 of Lovecraft Country titled Whitey's on the Moon. I know that the first review was a bit long, but we had a lot to break down. I mean, we were just sort of building the foundation. But luckily, episode 2 is mostly action. So, honestly, I don't expect this breakdown or review to take long. So, let's get started. Let's first just break down the title itself, Whitey's on the Moon, which is a poem by Gil Scott-Heron. And so it sort of defines the opening of this. The poem, Whitey's on the Moon, is sort of about how the United States created the space program. It sort of served as a distraction for the strife that was sort of happening in America at the time. I mean, you had poverty, you had racism, you had segregation. And so this poem sort of displays how, or, in Gil Scott-Heron's mind, how the space program was a good, shiny object to distract people. And we also sort of see that in the opening montage. So we see George and Letty sort of enjoying their stay in this mansion. George is sort of surrounded by his favorite books and authors. Letty is doing these amazing costume changes. So shout out to the costume designers, because I appreciate a show that respects a costume budget. So this montage is kind of countered by what's happening with Tick. So while, Letty is having her Pantene moment, because I also wanted to make note of the hair on this show. There's body, there's moisture, there's movement. 2 thumbs up. Juxtaposed to that, we have Tick in his room looking sullen and sort of distraught because he's still thinking about what happened last night. And honestly, that montage was a distraction for me too. The show opened and I'm not thinking, well, what happened to the monsters? I'm just sort of enjoying Letty trying out these outfits. So yeah, I mean, it worked on me too. They're all alarmed by this bell, and it sends them to the hallway where they're greeted by William. William is the guy who answered the door at the end of episode 1. He lets them know it's just the lunch bell and they'll be having lunch on the veranda. Tick sort of inquires if William has any more information about his father. He was supposed to go to Boston, he hadn't been back, and William tells him, I'm Braithwaite, I'm just a friend of the family, and all I'm supposed to do is be nice to you black folks until they get back. So I'm doing as much as I'm going to do. As they're being led to the veranda, they get a little bit more information about the Braithwaite family and the lodge itself. So the original owner of the house, Titus Braithwaite, is sort of the founder of everything. And so Samuel Braithwaite is connected to Titus as a distant cousin. But we also learn that Titus Braithwaite had sexual relationships with his slaves. And so that's how Tick is related to this family. So Tick is a direct descendant of Titus Braithwaite, because he is a descendant of one of the slaves that he impregnated. And so put a pin in that, because I think that that's something worthy of keeping track of, and I'll explain it a little bit later in this review. So the next time we see everybody, they're having lunch. Letty's still distracted by everything that's happening. She's asking for salt from the butler. She's enjoying her food. George is extolling all the books that are in there and all his favorite authors and how it's just like a dream. And then Tick is kind of like, do you not remember what happened last night? And it's only then that they sort of come to this realization that they have no memory, no recollection of seeing sheriffs being eaten by monsters, almost being eaten themselves, and being covered in blood. They have no recollection of it at all, which is interesting. As they're going into town, let's describe this town for a second. It's very Protestant Pilgrim. It reminds me of that horror movie, The Witch, The Wicker Man, Children of the Corn. It's very white, it's very old school, and it makes me very nervous. But apparently it doesn't bother Tick, because once he hears that whistle that sent the Shoggoths away the night before, he motors up to this white woman who has 2 full-grown dogs that look vicious, and he's questioning her really aggressively. And Letty's freaked out, and I'm personally freaked out, because it's like, I know that you're freaked out, but also this is a white town with a white woman with 2 dogs, and you are a black man, and this is not the move. But luckily, because they're guests of the Braithwaites, they don't get murdered in the town, and they don't get any answers. The dog handler sort of wants to make it very clear that she's racist, and they go on their way, noting that the tower is made out of stone, and so it must have a stone basement, and that's where Montrose must be. And let's just pause here because I like this show, but that's a stretch. Like, oh, this building has a basement. That's where he's at. I'm sure that manor has basements too. Like, that manor has 20 rooms. Like, why wouldn't I keep him in this house? Why would I take him to this place that you've never seen before and put him in there? It's a stretch for me. So also, for me, it seemed like when they were having this conversation with the dog handler, it was like the afternoon. But somehow, on their way back, it's like dusk. Let's assume it's dusk because it seems like it's nighttime because the Shoggoths come back. You know, we know that they're sensitive to light, but it's nighttime now. The sun's gone down. And so they reappear and they attack the group again. Only this time, they're saved by Christina Braithwaite, who is the white woman who sort of caused that car wreck when she saved them earlier in Simmonsville. So now we know that the dog handler has one of the whistles that makes that sound, and Christina Braithwaite has a whistle that makes that sound, and that sound causes the Shoggoths to retreat. So basically, she sort of lets them know that, oh, these are our beasts, our sort of guardians, and these whistles sort of put them in check. But these whistles also cause George and Letty to lose their memory again. So they have no recollection of what just happened 30 seconds prior. So let's talk about what happens then, because then the story sort of takes two parallel journeys at once. So there's what's happening with Tick, and then there's what's happening with George and Letty. So let's start with George. So George is back in his room. He sees all these books, and one book particularly catches his eye. And I think it's always important to sort of see if these books help tell a larger story, and in this case it does. The name of this book is The House on the Borderlands and Others, also published by Arkham House, which is the publisher of the H.P. Lovecraft book. The author of this book is William Hope Hodgson, and he's a supernatural, so the story is a supernatural horror sort of thriller, sort of like how H.P. Lovecraft's stories are sort of space and creatures and horror. You know, it's just sort of a shout out to the other writers of that time, the contemporaries of H.P. Lovecraft, the influencers of H.P. Lovecraft, those influenced by H.P. Lovecraft. I think we're going to see a lot of those things sort of ticked off as we get through this series. So, as he sort of goes to take this book off the shelf, the book opens a passage, and behind that passage is this huge library. It's giving me like Westworld vibes. I mean, massive. But on the table, there's one specific book called The Order of the Ancient Dawn, Bylaws. And so we see George pick that up, and it plays a part in a little bit later down the story, so I'll pick that back up when we get there. So let's go with Tick. So Tick makes it to Samuel Braithwaite's laboratory, and he goes into the room, and Samuel and Christina are there. And at this point, we see Samuel is having surgery, and there's some guy in this like creepy robe removing a piece of his rib. So once he's sewn up, he hops off the table, and we sort of start this conversation between Sam and Tick that revolves around a painting. So the painting, according to Samuel Braithwaite, is titled Genesis 2:39 by Joseph Tannhauser. And so the painting sort of tells the story of Adam naming all the beasts and creatures of the land. So let's break that down, because Joseph Tannhauser is not a real person. And that painting is not called Genesis 2:39. It's actually called The Naming of Animals, and it's by an artist called John Miles. Now, the cool thing here is that we could assume that Joseph Tannhauser, that name, is sort of an amalgamation of different pieces of information. And so there's actually a German play called Tannhauser by Wagner. And so that German play was first premiered or debuted by the opera singer Josef, let me get this name right, Tikacek. So Josef Tikacek was the first person to play the character of Tannhauser in the opera written by the German composer Wagner. So putting all those pieces together, it's kind of like this nod to German nationalism or socialism and the Nazis, sort of by using this German play, and then its connection to the Braithwaites, because, I mean, we've seen this sort of display of racism throughout sort of their experiences with them. And so this painting and sort of Samuel Braithwaite's description of it as sort of this nirvana where everything has its place and the hierarchy is understood and not upset. So in this story, he's Adam, and so he's the one on earth who is establishing the hierarchy of who's in power. And we also know sort of in that story, Adam was top of that hierarchy. So what they would like to do is return to this Eden, where in Samuel's view, he would be the Adam and he would establish the hierarchy of power. So after that little conversation is over, Christina walks Tick back to his room and they have a little bit of conversation. He's trying to figure out why he can remember what's happening, but George and Letty can't. And he sort of deduces that the Braithwaites are doing some sort of creepy magic spell or something. And then Tick sort of calls them racist. And there's this great line, I think, that Christina says, where it's kind of like, my father and his friends would never associate with the KKK. They're too poor. They're too poor. But it also sort of shows how, you know, capitalism trumps racism, and even within racism and race issues, there's an extra layer of sort of capitalism that plays a part, which is true in society today. So, you know, Christina sort of does take a favor by removing sort of this memory block for Tick and for Letty and George. And at that moment, like, you hear Letty freaking out because they remember what happened and they remember they're trapped in these rooms. And so the bright, shiny distraction is gone and they sort of realize the reality of what's happening. And then we flip over to Christina sort of going to this cow that's giving birth that's in breach. So she sort of assists the cow giving birth and she pulls out a shoggoth. And so that sort of tells us that the Braithwaites are using their farm and these cows to breed these beasts that are like roaming their lands. And that's why they're in control of them. And I say put a pin in that. I think that's going to play a role forward. But damn, that poor cow. Okay, so then we get to like a lot of the action that's happening right now. And so all three of them, Tick, George, and Letty, are trapped in their rooms, sort of dealing with the reality of what's happening now because that memory block is gone. But now they're also sort of all being accosted by very specific illusions. And so this sort of clone of Tick that Letty isn't aware of at the time sort of storms into Letty's room and sort of gets her to sort of tell more of her backstory about how she had issues with her mother and this, that, and the third. But we see Tick in his room having a fight with what we can assume is a Korean War soldier. So there's a connection here that we don't have yet, so put a pin in this part, and we'll just keep watching that as things progress. And so we get to George, and George is met by the ghost of Dora Freeman. Now, I did a little bit more research to help break this part down. Dora Freeman is Tick's mother and Montrose's ex-wife, and that's also the woman that was in Montrose's wallet, and there seems to be a very close relationship here. So now we're getting hints that some things might be amiss, and we sort of get that confirmation that things are amiss a little bit later. I'll get to that, so I put a pin in it. But then we sort of have this really interesting moment where, you know, while sort of George is having this very emotional reunion with Dora, and Tick is having this sort of really physical altercation and interaction with this Korean soldier, Letty is in this room with sort of this illusion of Tick, who is sort of trying to comfort her and make her feel at peace and at ease. And so it leads into like a moment of passion. They're kissing. And so then this clone Tick sort of stands up and he starts to like undo his pants. And then when he opens his pants, this like snake pops out. Who, me? I didn't see anything. So once we zoom out of them in their rooms, we see the guests of Samuel Braithwaite, all these old white men sort of in the hallway, looking at sort of Letty, Tick, and George having these experiences. And it's kind of like, oh, are they being like entertained by Black trauma? That's on the nose. So we get to the dinner, and lo and behold, that rib that Samuel was having removed is being served to all the guests of the Order of the Ancient Dawn, including George and Tick. And sort of George says, don't eat that. And it's kind of like, oh, you don't need to tell me not to eat a person's human flesh. But I guess it's sort of like, at this point, Samuel Braithwaite's gone from being Adam in his story to being Christ in his story because, you know, he's like, take, eat, this is my body. Okay. George gets up and sort of like, you know, in his gotcha moment, I, you know, read the bylaws, and it says that the sons of Adam, which is basically sort of any descendant of Titus Braithwaite, has sort of ranking in this order, and all members are required to obey their commands. And so this is the moment where Tick gets up.
All the Caucasians to the back. Immediately. Honestly, thank you. Looks better already.
So again, I have to say that this whole Montrose part is just like it's not working for me. So they decide to sort of go back to this stone tower in town where there's a basement, and they assume that that's where Montrose is being kept. And so they get to the tower, they go down the stairs, and they sort of see that someone was obviously staying in this basement at some point, and we can deduce that it's Montrose. Then that racist dog handler shows up at the stairs with a shotgun. Being racist, and then Letty knocks her out. So thank God Letty decided to keep going with them, because I mean she's really been responsible for saving the day several times. So then they're struck with this inspiration of Count of Monte Cristo, the book that Montrose was reading before he disappeared in Chicago. And so they deduce that Montrose has built this passage behind the wall and built a tunnel to escape. And then they're able to drive and meet Montrose exactly where he's digging himself out. It's a lot of a stretch, but then they come to rescue Montrose, and Montrose is like super disrespectful and ungrateful and rude, and like I would send like the white dog catcher back for you, because one, we don't have a relationship. Ooh, I'm about to rant. Montrose is ungrateful, and it is not a nice reunion. Letty's like, wrap this up and deal with your family trauma after we escape all these evil white people. And so as they're trying to drive out of the town, going under that covered bridge they first came in at the end of the episode 1, we hit some sort of psychic wall, the same sort of one that killed the racist in the first episode when it flipped over the truck. This causes like this major collision that pretty much disorients everyone in the car. So when Letty gets out of the car, she's met by Samuel and Christina Braithwaite, who we can assume put up the barrier to cause the crash. And Samuel pulls out a gun and shoots Letty in the stomach, and she dies. And he also shoots George. So then sort of Christina says that, you participated in the ritual, we'll save George from his gunshot wound like we saved Letty. And we find out that, we saw Letty die before the screen went black. But when we come back, we see that Letty is awake and alive. And we could basically assume that she's been revived. The bullet wound is gone, and she's still covered in blood. So it happened. But somehow the Order of Ancient Dawn has mastered some of the magic, and they're able to heal people. So Letty's alive, and she's freaking out. I wonder if that has something to do with like her actually dying and experiencing death and coming back to life. So put a pin in that. I think that's something to look into later. So the ritual is taking place, and so as Samuel's performing the ritual, Titus is in the middle, and we can see that the ritual is working. There's this portal opening, and it also looks to be causing Titus a tremendous amount of pain. But then something sort of sparks directly from that ring itself, and as that portal opens, Titus gets a visual of a black pregnant woman, which we deduce is his ancestor, the slave who was impregnated by Titus Braithwaite, the founder of the Order of Ancient Dawn. And so she sort of has this look on her face. She's not saying anything. She's sort of just making this eye contact with Tick. And at some point, the ritual sort of gets out of control. It backfires, and all the energy that was flowing into Tick sort of dispels into the room and kills everyone in the room, causes the lodge to start to fall apart. Now, while Montrose, Tick, and Montrose, George, and Letty are still in their respective bedrooms, the lodge starts to fall apart. Also, let me just go back and note, that I think we sort of established that we established this with the conversation with George and Dora, but sort of George and Montrose basically confirm what we were getting hinted at in that meeting, and it's that Tick might be George's son, but we don't know for sure. Montrose and George sort of agreed not to talk about it, and this also might play a part into why Montrose is so hard on Tick, maybe because he reminds him of that infidelity with Dora's infidelity with his brother. So we can put a pin in sort of that biological father narrative. We don't know that yet, but we do know that there was a previous relationship between George and Dora. So flipping forward. The house is falling apart. Letty, George, and Dora make a break for it out of the house, Letty being a hero again. And then we also see Tick being guided out of the house by this apparition of his ancestor. So yeah, black women save people in this show. I'm with that. I like when shows tell the truth. And then also, in my mind, it's sort of an allusion to sort of this recreation of her escape from when the house sort of fell apart in 1833. And so we also see that when Tick gets to the exit, we see his ancestors sort of standing at the exit with a book under her arm. And so in my mind, I imagine that this is the Book of Names. And so maybe, Dora's ancestors have access to that book somewhere. And so they might actually have more knowledge than they think. Tick escapes. The entire house is brought to ruin. And he's met by Letty outside. Letty, George, and Montrose also escaped. However, sort of just this sort of eye contact communicates that George died. He bled out, and he was not able to be revived the way that Samuel revived Letty. And so we sort of deal with Tick and Montrose sort of dealing with when Tick's uncle dying and Montrose's brother sort of dying in his arms. And it's a very sort of tragic moment. It's a lot. So I thought this was a great episode. I'm looking forward to episode 3. I really like the way that they sort of inject these sort of cultural notes. Joseph Tannhauser and the Adam's rib thing. I think that those are really clever plays on sort of culture and history. So I enjoy the show, and I'll be with you next week to review episode 3.